Good morning, everyone. We're continuing in our quest for knowledge. Second, admit. Wonderful. Okay. Let's see, I'll do this here.
Okay.
Shalom, everyone.
Good morning.
Here. All right, we're continuing our quest for knowledge. Somebody suggested I put this in the middle, so I'll put it in the middle. Okay. Our question for knowledge. Oh, what are we talking about now? It's a little bit Kabbalistic, what we're talking about. Actually, it's sort of a lot Kabbalistic, but it's basically understandable. What is the Rebbe trying to do? The Rebbe is trying to explain to us a little bit what is God, so that at least we have some sort of a idea who we're praying to, what we're talking about. Who is the God that spoke to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? Why don't we accept the other religions? What's wrong with the other religions? What's wrong with these other religions? So it's much more than just saying that our book is true and their book is not true. Our book can be validated. Their books cannot be validated. Our books had the Torah, Lahavdil, had millions and millions of eyewitnesses that actually saw it, and the rabbis were holy and they could raise the dead and everything. That's true. That's also true. But that's not the main point. We say in our prayers, Ein Kelokeinu, there's nothing like our God. Ein Kelokeinu, Ein Karan, there's nothing like our God. What does it mean there's nothing like our God? All the religions have some worship of some superior force. It's up to, and especially there's the religions that claim to replace Judaism. For sure, they're right. Which is no. What about Islam? Christianity is idolatry, right? They really, but Islam, what's wrong with that? They believe in this. No. Ein Kelokeinu, the God that we believe in is not like the God of the other nations. Not like the God of other nations. True Islam does not worship idols. They do turn themselves only to the one God, the Creator. But how the Creator works in the world and the Creator's relationship with the world and what is the message of Abraham to the world is totally different from everybody else. So, okay, the Rebbe here is explaining this a little bit. What's so not understandable about God? What's so not understandable about God? At first glance, it's pretty understandable. You want to believe that what was the beginning of the world? It started off with God. What do the scientists say? Either they say the world always was, it always existed in some form or another. Either it was, what do they call it? The ether, or some sort of spirit, or some sort of black holes, or energy, or forces, or something. But it always existed somehow. And the Jews say no, that it existed from God. Okay, so you believe this way and you believe that way. Of course, the big fault with that is that science is not based on belief. It's based on facts. And they say the beginning of the world, they have no facts. So they're basing it also on belief, which makes science sort of like religion. That's why it's so malleable nowadays that they can say, okay, Judaism says, no, God started. So, okay, so that's sort of logical. Either it started this way or that way. Take your choice. So we say, no. According to Judaism, God creates everything all the time. And God cares about everything. He cares about every single detail there is in the world. And God favors certain things. There are certain things that God, the creator of the universe, wants us to do and doesn't want us to do. That's the whole story of God choosing the Jews, choosing Abraham, the Jews going down into Egypt, suffering there for a long time, getting out, receiving the Torah, so that all this was just so God would let us know exactly what he wants, what we should do, and how we should do it. And also, what's the goal? Now, what's the goal? This is sort of the difference between all the different, they say, movements in genuine Judaism. Genuine Judaism. Now, I'm not saying these people are, the people who are not genuine Reformed Jews are not Jews. They're Jews. If their mother was Jewish, if they converted, properly, they're Jews. We're not talking about what's a Jew. We're talking about what is Judaism. So Judaism believes in God. The point is, what's the goal? What's the goal? Chabad has taken on themselves the goal which they believe is the goal of Abraham. namely, Dir B'Tachtonim, that the whole world should become a dwelling and a revelation of God, just like the Holy Temple. And when you went to the Holy Temple, what did you do? There was work. You had to work. You had to bring sacrifices. It was dynamic over there. The world should be dynamic. Okay, now let's get to God. On one hand, we say that God creates everything. On the other hand, we say that God is involved in everything. God cares about it. Then we see that God has emotions. God got angry. Got angry at Adam, evicted him from the Gan Eden, got angry at the generation of the flood. And then God said he regretted it, and now he has mercy, and now God is kind. We see God is kind. There he creates the world, gives us eyeballs and ears and for free, right? All these bugs and things, he's creating it for free. We see the amazing harmony of God. So all these are aspects of God. So where's God in this whole picture? So we say there's nothing except for God. Everything is God. God is creating everything. So if everything is God, then why can't we worship everything, anything we want? He says, no, those are aspects of God. Those are creations of God. But the essence of God, God conceals himself. So if you remember what we learned up to now, right? What did we learn up to now? We said, so far we've learned that there's three basic aspects of God. And we can learn this something from something like our soul, ourselves. Man is created in the image of God. Here we go. Okay. So just like in a person, that's what he says. We have the essence of the person. Then we have the person's qualities and personality, his intellect, his emotions. And then we have how he expresses it, his thought, his speech, his action. His thought, he only expresses it to himself. But the thought is the beginning of going out. So we have, so to speak, our self. Then we have our intellect and emotions. That's like a garment, but a close garment, a unified garment. Here he calls it tikkunim. And then we have thought, speech, and action. That's like a separate garment for our soul. We changed all the time. Similarly, also, that's what we got up to now. Al derech says, similarly, Yuvan will be understood. You really like this thing of me in the middle? I don't know. Not only that, this bar with the picture, and once again, I want to get my, put this thing on this. Oh, see, look at this. It's accessible. Here we go. Yeah, okay, let's try it. We'll try it. Al derech says, similarly, Yuvan, we can understand above, the Ytzira and the 10 Sfirot, that they're called tikkunim. And so we said that God has what's called 10 aspects, facets of his personality. And everything in the world has these 10 facets. Everything, but especially they're active in God and in man. That's what we call the tikkunim. Those are what's called God's Sfirot, God's personality, if you want to call it. Hainu Chachma, God's wisdom, intellect, and the emotions of Atzilut. This is what we got up to yesterday, remember? But Bria, Ytzira, and Asiya, these are separate garments. These are like thought, speech, and action. Okay, again. God, we have God's essence, right? Then we have God's emotions. That's already getting into what we call the world of Atzilut. Now, there's 4 worlds. We call it 4 worlds, or maybe to make it more understandable, 4 dimensions of godliness. And each one of these dimensions is infinitely more real than we are. Me and you. All right, sorry to break the bad news, but that's the way it goes. We think that we're the ultimate reality. Here we are. We're the ultimate reality. The fact is that there couldn't be anything further from the truth. In fact, according to what Rebbe is saying here, this is like 5 steps removed from the truth. The truth is, the ultimate truth is that there's God. 1 step removed from the truth is the world of Atzilut. That's the inner garments of God, like we talked about, that God 10 Sfirot. Then we have the world of Bria, that's like God's thought. The world of Ytzira, that's like God's speech. Then the world of Asiya, that's like God's action. Each one is closer to us and further removed from the truth. That's only the beginning. We'll see you get this. These are separate garments. Behold, Antu Chachim, that would have said that God, you are wise. Antu, you are. This is Orin Sof. What does it mean? The infinite light of God, the infinite God himself, so to speak, Shenimshach, which is drawn into Chachma. Chachma is the highest of the 10 Sfirot, right? You should go over, do your homework a little bit. The 10 Sfirot. Look it up anywhere. You can look it up in Chabad org. And what are the 10 Sfirot? So these 10 Sfirot, these are the 10 aspects of God's personality and the 10 aspects of our personality, our soul, if you want to talk about of our soul. Like it says, the place where you find God's greatness, there you find God's humility. God comes down to this level of Chachma. This is what's called Chachma of Atzilut. So we have God's essence, and then somehow or other, which we'll discuss this in a minute, that's going to be the Tzimtzum. And somehow or other, God comes from his essence to have these 10 Sfirot, to be enclosed in the world of Atzilut, which is, we said, like is a garment that's unified, like a body is unified with a person's soul, something like that. But God comes down to be called wise, because God is the source of Chachma. From God can be this level of Chachma, this level of wisdom. Another definition of the word Chachma, that's sort of a how do you say, a non-descriptive term, wisdom. Chachma also means life. Life. Like everybody is alive, everybody's aware you're alive. That awareness that you're alive, that's called Chachma. The awareness of the existence of the thing, but not understanding what it is, that's called Chachma. Being is understanding already. So if so, we say that God in this aspect of Atzilut, which Atzilut is the highest dimension, which is close to God. It's the most godly, the most real of the God's dimensions to create the world. And there is revealed God's Sfirot. But they're not really Sfirot. It's not really any sort of wisdom or life or understanding in any way that we can possibly comprehend it. It's just the source of what's called wisdom of the worlds where the angels are and the souls are, Bria, Ytzira, and Asiya. Hagam, even though she ain't our Chachman, the Bria, even though there's no comparison to the wisdom, how it is in Bria to the way it is in Atzilut, and how much more so there's no comparison to the Chachma, God's life force, how it is in Asiya, the lowest of the four worlds, to how it is in Atzilut, the Odnikra B'Shem Chacham, Ayin Shem Zeh. But nevertheless, Chachma, how it is in Atzilut, is called Chachma. Why? Because it's the source. In a ha'inyan yuvan, we can understand, like it says, Ein lecha kol esev v'gavoa me'al gavoa. The Rebbe is going to give us an example of how physical things in this world can emanate from spiritual principles that are more real than the physical manifestation. Here, let's see. For instance, an apple. You ever eat an apple? Eat an apple. Okay, if you want to understand what's going on, get a nice sweet apple and eat an apple, or remember sometime you ate an apple. And if you don't want to remember an apple, a grape, okay? A nice, sweet, good tasting grape. There is such a thing. A grape, you don't like grapes, then a mango, whatever it is, a nice, sweet tasting fruit, okay? That I'm sure everybody understands. And now let's get a little bit more. What's grapes and apples and mangoes? What's that got to do with Kabbalah? So what it has to do with Kabbalah, that's exactly the whole point here. We're trying to explain this world and how this world relates to God and how it can be that God, who is infinite. And then we said 5 times removed. That's just to make it easy understood. 1,000,000,000 times removed God's reality from this world. Nevertheless, the world comes from God, and it comes from God's aspect. So let's take an example: a nice, sweet, juicy, fresh apple. Yesh bo matikos, it's got sweetness. V'chich ochel v'itam, and your palate eats and it enjoys it and tastes it. Hayim ne'amar, what do you want to say? Sheyesh b'koach hatzomeach, there is in the power of growth in the ground. Right? You put that seed, an apple seed, in the ground, and that awakens some sort of a weird power in the ground to grow up this tree. Now you want to say for the tree is much bigger than the seed, and the tree all of a sudden has color. The seed didn't have much of this at all. But let's say it did. Then all of a sudden you get green, you have flowers, then the flowers have fragrance, and then you get the apple. The apple has this beautiful red color, and the apple is also sweet. Where did the sweetness come from? It came from the ground. The seed, it can't come from the seed because the seed rotted. There's no more seed. Look around for the seed, you won't find it. What do you see? You see the ground is nourishing this tree and pumping into it life. And this life, somehow or other, mysteriously, is translated into the sweetness of the tree, the sweetness of the apple. So you want to say that in the ground, there's some sort of sweetness. And what about the source of this source? So the ground is the source of sweetness, but there's a source of the spiritual sweetness in the ground. That's the mazal. That's the spiritual force, right? In the heavens, she'eno me'erech, it's not compared to this at all. So the sweetness of the ground is incomparably more spiritual, if you want to call it, than the sweetness of the apple. But it must be more real because it gives birth to the apple. Similar to the sweetness which is in heaven, which gives birth to the sweetness in the ground. Ella, but, move this bothers me, excuse me, here we go. Ella, but, the whole topic is like this. Shamatikos, that this sweetness, nimshach, is drawn michesed, from what's called chesed, one of those 10 Sfirot we talked about. Chesed. And bitterness, there's some apples that are like bitter apples, that's drawn from gvura, another one of the 10 Sfirot. Hariyim and yanim ruchnim, this is very spiritual. Rak should be shtalshlut, but when they chain down and they come down into this world from level to level, as nitgashmu, they get more physical, ad until shenimshach mi bechinet chesed umatikot, until there comes from this level of sweetness, of God's kindness, there comes the sweetness of the apple. Okay, so everything in the world, if so, derives itself from some sort of a spiritual source. Everything in this world takes up a place. That's chesed. That's bigness. Everything in the world has a limit. That's kavura. Everything in the world has some sort of a, balance in it. That's tiferet. That it works, right? Things that don't work, they die. Even though there's no comparison between the spiritual source, the chesed of, let's say, Atzilut or Bria, whatever, and the sweetness of the apple, nevertheless, it is in the same direction. It's the same sort of a thing. Like we can see, there's many types of sweetness and pleasantness, spiritual, like the pleasantness of a good idea. This is also sweet. The pleasant of music, right? A beautiful voice that comes from the heart. This is the aspect of emotions. So there's all these different types of beauty or kindness or sweetness or goodness that comes from what's called God's kindness, God's chesed. Then there's all sorts of limitations and difficulties and boundaries. That all comes from God's severity. And therefore, Bakami Yuridos, many descent, Pishtalshlus, and a chain. It's like the chain of creation, of emanation, of revelation of God. There becomes this physical sweetness of the tree. Hagam she'efresh, even though the separation and the difference between the physical and the spiritual is very great between them. And this is also as it is with the idea of God's kindness, from God's good or God's love comes sweetness of the apple. Also the same thing, let's take higher Sfirot, God's intellect, Chachma. There's levels upon levels upon levels of this Chachma of life. Hagam, even though the Chachma, the Bria, even though this level of the life force, which is the top of the world of Bria, it is not comparable. And it is not in any way like the Chachma that we see in our physical world. Nevertheless, it is somehow or other a source that from it can be these things. Chachma of Asio Aniglas. So the wisdom, even that we have the wisdom, let's say, of the Torah, tremendous wisdom in the Torah. And it's a spiritual wisdom. This is nowhere near comparable to the wisdom of the Torah, the ideas of the Torah, how they are in, let's say, the world of Ytzira. That's called the lower heaven, Gan Eden Atachton. And it says up there that there's heavenly courts. They sit and they learn Torah. That's the idea of judgment. The person is judged according to the Torah. Then there's higher than that, there's the world of Bria. That's what's called the upper Gan Eden. And also we get the Chachma of Atzilut. Even though that it's the level of Chachma, what we said in this statement by Elijah the prophet, Pirki Petach Eliyahu, even though that this is called wisdom, but no known type of wisdom, that God has wisdom in Atzilut, that even the angels aren't aware. The angels which are in the world of Bria, the souls, whatever they're in Bria, they don't. Nevertheless, it is the source of Chachma. So if so, we have a pattern. The pattern of reality, the pattern of creation, the pattern of existence in this world, the same pattern of this world, that there's kindness and there's evil and that there's this, it's all in the upper worlds as well. But it's much, 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 much spiritual. Of all yod unto chacham, but because that you, God, you are wisdom, you are wise. But I know I'm shachas or, and so this is how God draws His infinite light into chachma. Just like we said, a person, our wisdom, our intellect is not us. It's just an emanation of us. It is my wisdom. But who is me? Who is this me? Because this me is drawn down into wisdom. That's the way God wanted the world to be. That things have an essence, but they are drawn outward, lower. That's the idea of up and down. Hine chachma, the chachma itself comes from me'ayin temotze. This aspect of God's chachma, this is what you call a life force. This comes from nothingness. There's, so to speak, nothing above it. Or let's say more exactly, any level above wisdom of Atzilut cannot be described. Here the Rebbe is going to say it's Keter, it's a crown. Therefore, this is what's called God's humility. This level of Atzilut, which is infinitely, infinitely greater than anything that we can possibly imagine. That's why it says on Mount Sinai that there was a revelation of Atzilut. And everybody's souls jumped out of their bodies. And this aspect of Atzilut that was revealed at Mount Sinai, this is a very low level for God. This is what's called Anvatnuto, God's humility. God comes down. Shehu Yerida Gadola, this is a tremendous descent before God. V'zeu Lashon Atzilut, that's the language of Atzilut. We said Atzilut is like, so to speak, the body of God, the jewelry. This is a garment to God which is united, so to speak, with God, like our body is united with our soul. That's the highest of the four worlds, called Atzilut. Atzilut in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew means Yerida Vashpala. Atzil means to emanate something. Something comes lower, comes out from a source. Midregoto Elyona, Lashpila Tatzmo, the world of Atzilut, which is the highest of worlds, which we learned in the Yom Yom that the first Rebbe of Chabad, he couldn't even say the word. It's so high. When he was writing, he wouldn't say it. He would say Eben, above. When he was writing, he could just write the first three letters. First two letters. That the world of Atzilut, which is infinitely high by us, we can't understand. We don't understand what spiritual at all means. What is spiritual? Right, spiritual. And we're talking about like the upper level of the world of Asiya. And here we're talking about these different levels of the soul before it comes into the body and the angels and all this stuff. Well, what are we talking about? But these things exist. We see that Isaiah saw the angels, Ezekiel saw the angels. Well, these are low levels of godliness. The Arizal, the big Kabbalists, as they talked about these worlds of Atzilut. And the Arizal, the Ytzira, he talked about levels above Atzilut. That's how we know about this. So it says this level of Atzilut, this was a low level in regard to God. The Lefi Omar, like it says, because Moses said, Me'ayin li basar. How can I? The people were clamoring; they wanted meat. The people got disgusted. The Jews got disgusted with fed up with the manna. So they said, "We want meat." So Moses said, "Where can I get meat? Me'ayin li basar. How can I possibly produce meat for them?" Why couldn't Moshe produce meat? He said, I can produce fish. Called dagei hayam shachet lehem. He said, I can give them fish. Can't give them meat. The Rebbe explained, and there's another mime. We'll get to that. Fish is of a higher level. Anyway, Moses couldn't come down. Moses was too high. That's why it says that Moses had trouble speaking because he was too high to bring his ideas into speech. That Moses was in a tremendously high level. Moses couldn't bring himself down to bring physical meat. Therefore, God said, here it is. No, God said, gather to me 70 men. A little bit lower. I know this is, where is it in Parshat, what is it, Chukat, isn't it? Pinchas. The Madrega Pechuta, they are lower. Hainu shalo yiyu mitgashmim mamish. So Moses said, I'm too high. I can't come down to the Jewish people. So God said, okay, you know what? I'll choose 70 people, and these 70 people, they'll be your. So let me make this thing go down here. 1 minute, please. I just want to. That's all. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm muted, yeah, because there's background noise over there. Okay. So God said, Atzalti, I will bring Atzilut, I will emanate myself from the spirit that's on you, and I will put that on them. What does it mean? That God said, I'm going to come down from your level, that it'll be below from your level. Vasamti alayam, and I'll put it on them. That the Shiyeh Yinika Gam La'em, that they would also be able to get nurture from this level of Atzilut, but they could not come to the level of Moses himself. Moses was like the level of Atzilut. He was too high. And even for Moses, when God spoke to Moses, it was a descent to Moses, the level of Atzilut where Moses was. This was a descent from God. Okay, what's the point? What does he want here? He wants to tell us that God's essence is totally beyond, any sort of definition. It makes no sense even to say that we can't understand God. If we say we can't understand God, that sort of implies that maybe we can't, but somebody else can. God himself is not in level of understanding, but God has this ability to come down and to conceal himself so that he can come down into lower levels. Kamokain similarly is above. That's the idea of Atzilut. Atzilut is a tremendous descent to be clothed, this infinite light of God, in Chachma, the highest of the 10 Sfirot. Therefore, the 10 Sfirot of Atzilut, the highest of the worlds, are called 10 Tikkunim. They're called 10 like jewels, bodies, if you want to call it. Shein, they are garments for Or Ein Sof, but they are not the essence of God. But in Levushim Mamish, they're not really 100%. They are not. I'm sorry. Levushim Mamish, they are not really external garments, like thought, speech, and action is. But they are tikkunim because God, in the world of Atzilut, He is one totally with His Sfirot. Okay, so what do we have? Like we said before, we have the essence of God, then we have the inner garments, the closest garments to God, that are unified, so to speak, with God. That's the world of Atzilut. That's the 10 Sfirot, how they are in Atzilut, which is not the case of Bria, Ytzira, and Asiyah. Okay, that's what it means, that you are one, but you cannot be counted. That God in His essence cannot be counted in the 10 Sfirot. All right, now just that you have to keep this in proper proportion over here. Don't think in any way that all these Sfirot and worlds that we're talking about are in any way separate from God. These are just emanations, if you want to call it by God. Let's say it's something like, I'm making this up, a person that knows how to disguise himself. Let's say we have a person that knows how to disguise himself, right? He can disguise himself. So he, like a spy. So we act like an American spy, and he goes to Russia. So he acts like a Russian, he talks like a Russian, he looks like a Russian. Everything about him is Russian, but he's not. He's just, but on the other hand, this disguise that he makes, this is him. This is the person. And that he's talking like a Russian doesn't mean that he's really a Russian, right? This is really him. Something like that, God disguises Himself. God disguises Himself to make it look like there's really a world and there's really people and that there's really. So all this is just, but still God. But it's God disguised inside of these things, God covering Himself, hiding Himself, withholding Himself, want to call it that way, which God doesn't really withhold Himself. This is where the whole analogy breaks down, because God, nothing is separate from God. God is everywhere. But God has this way of concealing Himself. We're going to learn this is going to be two ways. That's called Tzimtzum. The one is Tzimtzum and the other one is called the Parsa. We'll see. This is Kabbalistic stuff. What can we do? You want to try to understand God a little bit. So either you can just believe that God exists, which is okay. But if you have a mind, you're going to have a lot of questions. And this is at least approaching the questions, even though it does not answer the questions, but at least shows you a way to approach the questions that you have. Namely, if God is so infinite, how can He care about the world? If God is totally one, what does He care about a bug or a person or what we do? Right? So here we're saying that because there's these different levels of God. There's the essence of God. There's what's called the inner garments of God. That's the world of Atzilut. And then there's the outer garments of God. That's the world of Bria, Ytzira, and Asiyah. And this is all manifested in God's 10 Sfirot, how they are in Atzilut, how they are in these different worlds. That's what it means that you, God yourself, you are one, but you're not counted or divided or what do you want to call it, articulated in any of these worlds. This, what we call about God, you are one, and you are not in the world of Atzilut, Bria, Ytzira. This is referring to what's called Keter Elyon, God's upper crown. Hamamutza, which is the go-between, the connector between Ma'atzil, the emanator, V'ne'etzalim, and the emanations, the creator and the creations. She'en aroch, even though we'll see that that's not really, so let's just leave it, because really the creator is really Atzilut, and the creations is the world of Bria. That's Bria is the world of creation. The word Bria means creation. So we were saying that Ma'atzil, the emanator, and the world of Atzilut. What's the connector? Keter, what's called God's crown. Above, She'en aroch alav, there's no comparison to God at all. That's what we say when we say Ein Kelokeinu. There's nothing like our God. Ki'itavu techachma, because the creation of God's chachma, of God's life force, call it wisdom, the highest of the 10 Sfirot, the creation of that from Keter, this comes from ayin, from nothing, no thing, indescribable. You can't call it any name. It's just called a crown because it's above everything else. Below Kaseder Ishtalshlut, this does not come from an order of a chain, which is he's avut yesh mi yesh kuli. Okay, here we go. Right, in the world they have this thing called the Seder, the order of evolution. Essentially, that's what science is trying to do. What is science? Excuse me. What is science trying to do? Science is trying to make the incomprehensible comprehensible, which that's a good thing. The more you can make things understandable, the more they become usable. Right? They become usable. You can use it. You can use energy now. There's all sorts of new sources of energy and power. The big problem with science is, so once you know how to use everything, what's the goal? What do you use it for? What do you use it for? That was the big thing with Germany, right? The biggest scientists, the greatest geniuses they had over there, right? After the war, Russia and America had this big race to kidnap the scientists from Russia to use from Germany, I'm sorry. Because the Germans had a superior understanding of mechanics and power and things like that. The German scientists, good, so they had this intellect and they could explain all these things, but what did you do with it? What's the point? What's the goal? So if the goal is science, that's it. That is, science comes from science, right? We say no, that science is a product of God, and God wants us to use science, use all of our abilities in order to improve the world. Who says what improving the world is? Maybe a bigger Germany is improving the world. That's what the Nazis said. Maybe so. Therefore, God gave the Torah, and God in the Torah says, "No, you have to connect to me." Okay, one of the commandments of the Torah, in some ways, the main commandment of the Torah is that you have to love God. In order to love God, you have to understand something about God. And understanding is not good enough, right? I can understand, the stock market doesn't excite me. If I find out, that whatever some stock went up, 5,000%. So what do I care? If I have a share in that stock and it went up 5,000%, I'm excited. Very nice, right? It's the same thing with Kabala and these things. If you learn about Kabala and the Torah and etc., but you don't really feel that it's real, so you don't have any love for God. And there's a commandment to love God. You have to love, not just pretend you love, not like in a Shakespearean play or something, right? That you have to pretend you love. Act, you're a good actor. You have to genuinely love God and appreciate God. So this Chassidut is coming to explain at least a little bit of God. And of course, you have to think into these ideas, because you can also learn Chassidut and also, not take it to heart. It says you should know today and take it to your heart that God is one. And this is explaining God's oneness. Because how can you say God's one? God is one when you see all this diversity in the world, and even more that God cares about all this diversity. So that must divide God, doesn't it? Almost in all the worlds, Atzilut, Bria, Ytzira, there's what's called a crown that connects between one dimension and the other. Because the lowest level of Atzilut becomes a crown to the world below Atzilut, that's called Bria. And Malchut, the lowest level of Bria, that becomes a crown to Ytzira. But what's the difference between the crown of Atzilut and the crown which is on the other worlds? Because the creation, the coming into being of the world of Atzilut is something from nothing. Something from nothing. What does it mean? God is nothing. God creates him. God is nothing. So yeah, God is not a thing. God cannot be explained. God cannot be described. God is not in any way an existence. God does not exist. God creates all existence. God creates all existence. Atzilut is an existence, the highest possible You can even above spiritual existence, but it's an existence. God does not exist in that way. God creates all existence constantly. And to the degree that nothing is outside of God, so God exists. All the other worlds are created one from the other, right? It's what do you call it? That's called the chain of creation. There's what's called the link, which connects one higher dimension to a lower. That's called Keter. Except for the world of Atzilut. Atzilut also as a Keter. But the world of Atzilut is created by means of a Tzimtzum. What's Tzimtzum? Tzimtzum means a contraction. You'll see what it means. 1 second. Contracting of the light of God to be makom panoi, that there will be an empty place. But Bria, Ytzira, and Asiya, this comes not by means of this contraction or this concealment or this empty space, but it comes by means of a parsa, by means of a veil. Hamafsik, which separates between Atzilut and Bria, between Bria and Ytzira and Asiya, but there is not a makom panoi. It is not an empty place. Again, remember, we're talking about Kabbalistic things here. So we're talking about things that are more real than we are. We're not talking about spiritual things that are less real than we are. We're real, we're physical, we're real. And the other worlds, they're spiritual, right? They're less real. Not so. In fact, the upper worlds are so infinitely real that we can't take it. You get a revelation of like an angel. An angel is so real that you totally would freak out, die. It says, by Samson's parents were dead. We saw an angel. Vahefresh, the difference between a parsa and an empty place. So we said, in order to create this world of Atzilut, which is the highest of worlds, there has to be this empty place. Let's understand, what does it mean that God made a tzimtzum, a contraction in his light? What does it mean God contracted his light? Now, God did not contract himself. God cannot be changed. But God has what's called his light, his name, if you want to call it. Kihine, or and so the infinite light of God. Hainu, or this is the revelation to be, especially that God has the ability to spread out, to lower himself. And this is a source, the chayus, the or and so, this light and the light of God in God's essence. This is what's called, it's this God's essence and his light. That's what the Arizal called it. And it shines and it spreads and it to create and to enliven. Huh? So all this physical, all we have is this physical world. We can't see it. We can't see these upper worlds. So all we have is to extrapolate from this world. This world exists. This world is only light and life force of God. That's all it is. Take away the light of God, the life force of God, then no world. Not only there is no world, there never was a world. Time itself is a creation. As soon as God removes his creative power, then there's no time, no future, no present, and no past. We can't conceive of this. I mean, I can't conceive of it, at least anyway, but that's the fact. That's what it means, that before God created the world, there was God and his name were alone. Hainu, namely, that there is Ein Sof, God himself. That's what's called Ein Sof. And God's name, this is the Or Ein Sof, this is the light of God's infinity. This is what's called God's name. God's light, God's name. This is how God reveals himself to create lower worlds, that he can be mitgale and mitpashet, that God can reveal himself like a ray of the sun that comes out of the sun, that this ray of the sun is a light which really was in the sun, but it, so to speak, emanates from the sun to shine on the earth. And the sun itself, the body of the sun, the light of the sun shines in the sun and it comes out of the sun. It's the same thing. God, before he created the world, there was God and his name. Of course, the difference is obvious that when the sunlight comes out of the sun, it's outside of the sun. And when God's name comes out of God, it is not out of God. It's still in God. So how can it appear to be out? So there, on that, God makes this, so to speak, empty space. He, so to speak, hides himself. Like I said, like the spy, he conceals his a true infinite identity. Or this light that comes from the sun, this is called the light, just like it's written by Yikra Elohim La'or in the beginning of the creation, that God called light day. This is called light. Why is it called light? Why isn't it called God's spirit or God's power or God's energy or something like that? Why? Because light spreads out. And a ray from the sun, a ray from the source of light, it shines out in the daytime, which is not the case, the essence of the sun. The essence of the sun is not called light, it is called the illuminator. It is called the source of light. The light bulb. Not a good. So God is the source of light. God is like the sun, and this world is like the emanations from the sun. Like it says, at God created the two great lights, and so it is in the infinite light of God, that this light is called the revelation. That it comes out from him and himself. This is what's called, God is called the illuminator, the source of light. And in order to come from this source of light to be actual light, in other words, to come from the essence of God, to be a world, let's say the world of Atzilut we're talking about, so there has to be what's called a tzimtzum, that the light was included in its source. As we're going to talk about more, God willing, tomorrow, let's do the Devar Malchut. 1 second.